being observant is not a skill you're born with or not born with. Being observant is a choice. And if you're going to be observant, whether it's the things that you actually see or hear in real life, or the things that you notice when you're looking online, it's the same power of observation that you're trying to nurture. And the more you can do that, instead of constantly trying to multitask or constantly trying to fill any gap in time with something, the better off you're going to be and the more things you're going to notice.
We are all aware of the fact that multitasking doesn't really add value to our lives. We are all aware that being intentional about what you do, the kinds of habits that you put into your life, can make a difference in how you feel.
But it's really easy to feel like there's so much to do that multitasking is the only way to get it all done.
And that's the thing. It's an illusion that we're really getting it all done, and it doesn't make us happier.
Yeah, our happiness, or subjective well-being as it's often called, can depend on our habits, whether we're consciously and intentionally chosen them, or they've simply fallen into place without any thinking. Our guest today is calling us to be intentional, observe what's going on, take an accounting of what is going on in our lives, and decide how we want to spend our time.
Yeah, so I think it's time we welcome the listeners to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores human behavior through a behavioral science lens. I'm Kurt.
And I'm Tim. And we like to explore the why we do what we do with researchers, authors, and practitioners in a conversational setting in order to bring those insights to you. But Kurt, I have a couple of questions for you. First, how observant do you think you are?
Well, I didn't notice the gorilla the first time I saw the video. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm probably a 5 or a 6.
Gorilla?
Yeah. The invisible gorilla video.
Oh, okay.
I was focused on counting the number of passes the people in the white shirts were passing. So I really was good focusing there. Okay. But I totally missed the big gorilla walking through the scene, beating his chest.
Okay, gotcha. Me too, by the way. I didn't see it the first time either. Second question for you. Do you think you could be more observant?
I see where you're going with this. Yes. And according to our guest, we all can be more observant. And that can lead to being better at making predictions about our future.
That's right. And our guest, Rohit Bhargava, helps inspire people to see what others miss and be more open-minded. He is the founder of the Non-Obvious Company and Idea Press Publishing. Rohit previously spent 15 years as a marketing strategist for Ogilvy and Leo Burnett, is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author of 7 books. And another cool thing about Rohit is that he's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. So he takes learning and teaching very seriously.
So not only is he extremely observant, but he is witty, fun, and full of wonderful stories. Our conversation covered a lot of areas, from the difference between being a speed reader or a speed understander, to the model he uses to uncover his non-obvious trends, to tips on how we can improve how we pay attention to the world around us.
And we even get into a bit of conversation about changing our minds, confirmation bias, and even context.
One of our favorite topics.
As it is. And so with that, we ask you to sit back, take a deep sip of a Megatrend brew, and pay attention as we talk with Rohit Bhargava. Rohit Bhargava, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
We are really happy to have you here, and we're going to get started with a speed round because that's just what we do. So here's the big question, Coke or Pepsi?
I got to choose Coke because I went to Emory, which is a school that's basically funded by Coke. So I don't really have an option there. It's got to be Coke.
The whole town, Atlanta, is basically funded by Coke.
Yeah, that's basically true. Yeah.
Now, would you be tarred and feathered if you showed up with a Pepsi can on campus?
On Emory's campus? Yeah. You kind of would be.
Oh
but
my gosh.
anywhere else, you'd be fine.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So would you rather have dinner with your favorite musician, sports star, or actor?
I would rather have dinner with, I think, musician, because I just love what musicians do. And
Okay.
I'm fascinated by it. And I think I'd probably, if I knew them well enough, get a private concert out of it. So, that'd be enough.
Oh, yeah.
And do you have a person in mind?
There are so many. I mean, I would have loved. This would no longer be possible because he passed away. But I would have loved to have dinner with Neil Peart, the drummer from Rush,
Yes.
The
who
drummer.
was
Yes.
also just an amazing writer and
Yeah.
seemed like an amazing personality. Even though I don't actually, I never met him or anything. But just
No.
from what I could read, he
Yeah.
seemed like an amazing person.
No, I would agree with you that he would be a fantastic one. So, all right. So a follow up to that, this isn't part of the speed round, but just a follow up would, if to get a dinner with Neil Peart, would you eat cauliflower at that dinner?
No way. Cauliflower is not something that's meant to be eaten by humans.
Not even to bring him back from the dead for that dinner. Wow, that's a strong.
So you're saying I would have to eat cauliflower in order for him to come back
Yes.
from the dead?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd probably take one for the team then. Yeah.
Okay, all right,
I would
okay,
do that.
good,
I would do
okay,
that.
all right.
Yeah, I thought it was just on the menu. So like, no. Yeah, I would probably do that. I mean, that's
right.
worth it.
All right. I was going to say that's a real aversion to cauliflower if you're going that far. All right.
Okay, next speed round question. Which is more important for business to understand, a trend or a fad?
Definitely a trend, because a trend is something that implicates behavior, which is very topical for us. And whereas a fad is just usually a thing or a platform, but doesn't always correlate to behavior.
All right.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And for business, that's really key. So, all right. Last speed round question. Should we strive to be speed readers or speed understanders?
That is a layup. Speed understanders.
We offer that last question hopefully as a layup for most of our guests. So help us understand what do you mean when you talk about speed understanders versus speed readers?
So that is inspired by a quote from the great Isaac Asimov, a science fiction writer, but also just amazing individual who published hundreds of books in his lifetime, including, many people don't know, beyond his science fiction work. I mean, he published a guide to the entire Bible. He published a guide to every Shakespearean play ever written. I mean, he just did amazing, amazing stuff. And his quote was, "I'm not a speed reader, I'm a speed understander."
Yeah.
And that really inspired me, because we are in a world where we just have more stuff. We have so much information that the words have been thrown around like infobesity. Like, we just have so much information that we're just like filled with it, literally. And to me, a speed understander is someone who thinks about what to pay attention to and is intentional about what they choose not to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, because there is so much information out there that we can't pay attention to all of it. And so if we're not purposeful about that, then we can get caught up in whatever the latest doom strolling news feed,
And it happens all the time. I mean, I find myself also caught up in it, because it's like, it's targeted towards human curiosity. I mean, you see that article that says, "You won't believe what this star looks like now, 20 years later." And in the back of your mind, you're kind of like, what do they look like? And before you know it, you clicked on that thing and now you feel bad about yourself. It's like you just ate the entire pie and you feel guilty.
Yeah, I one of the things that you wrote, I thought this was a wonderful quote. You said, "In past interviews, I've described myself as a near futurist," and I thought it was interesting, because you said, "In the past, I used to describe myself that way," and it just got me thinking: do you describe yourself differently today? How would you describe yourself today?
Well, I think when you describe yourself, or when anyone describes you as a futurist, that comes with a lot of baggage and assumptions. And one of the assumptions that it comes with is, oh, this person's thinking about stuff that might or might not happen. They're basically guessing. And that is kind of the game of futurism for a lot of people, because when you predict what the world's going to be like in 2050, you don't know. I mean, you're just taking signals from what you see, and you're basically guessing. Now, it can be an educated guess. It can be an informed guess, hopefully. And a lot of academics who are really, really smart people are in the world of futurism. But to me, a near futurist is someone who essentially does what I do, which is observe what's happening today and then predict what I call the accelerating present, which is something that's happening now, but will be more impactful and shift our behaviors in the near term, in the next year, 2 years. And to me, that is much more valuable for anyone in business and really anyone who's trying to sort of get ready for the future to think about.
Well, I was thinking, is this you use the haystack method, right, to come to this?
That is, that's the term that I sort of coined to describe what I had discovered accidentally I had been doing. And one of the people who asked me a question, I think it was after a keynote, they asked a question saying, "So how do you find the needle in the haystack?" And off the cuff, sometimes our best ideas come from just a response to a question in the moment.
Yeah.
And for me in that moment, I said, well, I'm not searching for the needle in the haystack. I'm building the haystack and putting the needle in the middle of it. And that's kind of where this cliche flipped on its head for me. And I had started describing that as my haystack method. And the discipline behind it, the idea behind it is if you spend enough time gathering interesting, fascinating stories, instead of obsessing about why they're interesting or fascinating in the moment, then later on, you can start to spot the patterns that you would never have otherwise seen.
Go into the haystack method because it's about gathering, aggregating, elevating, naming, proving. So those are the kind of the 5 steps as I understand it. Can you talk a little bit about each of those? I don't necessarily get into a dissertation on the haystack method, but at least for our listeners to give them an overview of what you're talking about when you say this.
Yeah, the short version is if you train yourself to be a story collector, then you don't necessarily have to do something with every story when you save it.
Mm.
And I think a lot of times what happens is we put pressure on ourselves to understand the meaning of something in the same moment. And if you've ever been in a brainstorm and people say, "Oh, there's no bad ideas in a brainstorm," the intent of that is to try and get everyone to be open and be more inclusive. But actually, I mean, there are bad ideas in a brainstorm. There are always bad ideas. The problem is in the moment, you don't always know which one's which. You don't know what the bad idea is because you haven't taken the time to actually analyze it. And what happens in this haystack method, what I try and teach to people is, look, if every single day you saved one interesting story, right? At the end of 100 days, you would have 100 stories from the past 3 months, 3-ish months. Now you would go through those stories and say, okay, how many of them talk about artificial intelligence? How many of them talk about loneliness in our lives? How many of them talk about this other topic? The patterns start to emerge when you have enough time to gather all of those things. Now, you may not have seen that pattern if you're just looking at one story and trying to immediately come up with what that story means on that day. But after a period of time, those lessons, those themes start to emerge. And that's really what I try and teach to people, that if you take that longer approach, you will see patterns emerge that other people don't see because you're looking at the world differently.
When you were talking about the aggregating part, at least in your book, you were talking about starting with human needs. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant by starting with human needs and what does that look like?
Yeah, starting with human needs is really, to me, one of the things that is often forgotten in thinking about what stories or platforms or things matter, because we focus on the item. We focus on the product. We focus on the platform. We say, oh, Clubhouse is taking off right now as an app. And so the trend is Clubhouse, or the trend is Twitter, or the trend is 3D printing, or the trend is drones. And that's totally flawed thinking because a trend to me is never a thing. So for example, if the trend behind 3D printing, if you were to think about the trend behind that, perhaps the trend might be the desire to do it yourself, the desire to take back control of the things that you are making, the need for convenience. If I can 3D print a screw that I need to fix something at home, I don't have to go to the store to try and buy it or wait for it to arrive in the mail. I mean, these are the basic underlying human reasons why these technologies start to take off. And so if you think about like, well, why does an audio app take off a year into a pandemic? Maybe it's because we're sick of seeing each other on video, right? I mean, there are reasons, there are human reasons why certain things happen. And if you get to those, I think you get closer to why a trend is actually a trend.
Yeah. Along with this incredible power of observation that you have, there's a tremendous amount of intentionality in the way that you describe your work, that it's very purposeful, that you're not just just lazy, bouncing from one idea to the next. To be a collector of ideas. And I love how you describe the variety of ways that you can be a collector of ideas. It's not just one single method. It's collect them any way you want. Cut them out of cut a picture out of a magazine and throw it in the scrapbook. I think that it can be anything. I love that. But there is still this very, very, very high level of intentionality that you're bringing to the table. How did you come to that? Where did you get that sort of that? Yeah, I want to be really intentional about the way that I live my life, the way that I go about this.
Well, I'm glad that you noted that and that you really honed in on that, because it is intentional as opposed to a talent. And I think a lot of times what people will say is, "Oh, you're just really good at this stuff. Like you just have a natural ability to find the stories that matter and then aggregate them into these bigger themes and bigger trends." Or you went to school for such a long time to study this and now you're an expert in it because you studied it. Like we tend to find these reasons why someone is good at this instead of saying, "Oh, you must really wake up with an intention to notice the stuff that everyone else walks by," which is not necessarily a skill or a talent. It's an intention. And any of us could wake up in the morning and say, "Look, I'm going to walk down the street without looking at my phone all the time. I'm going to wake up and not go straight to email." But we don't. And it's not because those people who don't and who get other things done and focus on other things are inherently more talented at not emailing in the morning than we are, right? They just choose not to. And they're intentional about what they choose to do. And so that's what I try and teach to people. I say, look, being observant is not a skill you're born with or not born with. Being observant is a choice. And if you're going to be observant, whether it's the things that you actually see or hear in real life or the things that you notice when you're looking online, it's the same power of observation that you're trying to nurture. And the more you can do that instead of constantly trying to multitask or constantly trying to fill any gap in time with something, the better off you're going to be. And the more things you're going to notice.
Yeah. Well, and which goes to, you talk about mindsets a lot. This is a mindset of being intentional about those observations and paying attention and noticing things that might not necessarily reach our consciousness otherwise if we didn't have that. So what is it about? Are there certain mind states that you try to, when you're doing your teaching, that you say, hey, people should get into this type of mindset if they want to be observant or more observant around these things?
There are a few, I hesitate to call them hacks, but there are a few tricks to doing this. And one of them is something that it's a part of our mind that we tap anytime we have one of those games where it's like you see an image and someone says, "What one thing doesn't belong in this image?" And now all of a sudden our minds are in that state of, "Oh, I'm trying to find the outlier. I'm trying to find the thing that doesn't belong." Now, imagine if you took that same skill, which all of us can do, right? We've all had a picture like that or a challenge like that, maybe in grade school or maybe recently. What if you took that same intention and just applied it to your next experience that you're actually looking at and said, "What thing do I notice here that no one else is paying attention to? What thing when I'm watching an NFL broadcast, like what camera angle am I looking at, or what detail back in the corner in terms of the assistant coach and what they were doing am I paying attention to because it's not front and center. It's just something happening in the background." And so this is it's a thing that we can practice in our daily lives. And they always say that, look, if you're going to be good at a foreign language, you have to find opportunities to practice it. And this is sort of the same thing. You can train yourself to practice this intention by specifically doing it at different points in your life.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. You also talk about being brave enough to change your mind, right? How difficult is it to be brave enough to change your mind?
Well, it's getting harder and harder. I think.
That's a loaded question.
Just look at
Come on.
Well, I mean,
yeah. Well, look, I mean, not to behavioral psychology geek out on it, but like, look, there's a lot of behavioral psychology science, like psychology, that says once we make up our mind, like we have confirmation bias, right? We have a lot of things that force us, whether we realize it or not, to continue to think that thing and not change our mind. So to some degree, being what one of my friends, Ali Pitambali, calls persuadable, being persuadable requires you to rethink those things, those assumptions, those points of view that you have. And I think the only way that anyone can do that is by not letting themselves be defined by the stands that they have taken. Because the more you see a stand that you've taken or a belief or something that you've put out in the world as core to your identity, the less likely you are to change. And I saw a perfect example of this. I mean, I tend to, one of my secret techniques, if you will, can call it that, is that I read things that I'm not supposed to. I read things that are not targeted at me. And one of the things that I read all the time is Teen Vogue magazine, which is for 16-year-old girls. Okay. So there's no reason I should be reading that. The articles are not targeted to me. But one of the things I remember seeing, and this was back when Teen Vogue was in print, is they had a checklist essentially around outrage. And it said, how do you channel your outrage? And what was interesting to me was that the assumption that checklist made is that you are outraged. You must be, right? Because there's so many things in the world to be outraged about as a teenager, as a woman. And so the whole article was based on this premise of where do you channel your outrage? And I started thinking when I read that, well, what happens when I don't feel the outrage? Like, how do I define myself as someone other than the person who's outraged? And it didn't seem like there was a place for that. It was like, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. You're not doing your duty. And that type of positioning is dangerous because it means that you have to stay outraged.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up a really interesting point there, that it's not only the self-identity that we have about who we are as a person, but it is the societal pressures that are pointing to say that you need to be this type of person. You need to be an outraged person if you are a teenage girl, because everything else is. And so all of a sudden you're getting all the social pressure to conform within that as well. So I think that's a really fascinating piece of this. And I think there's a really big component we talk about in politics and everything else, this idea of, oh, you flip-flop, you change your mind too much. And that is often viewed as a negative thing. And again, science in general, behavioral science in particular, that's how science moves forward. That's how we move forward, is we look at those beliefs that we have and say, hey, is this really true? And let's figure out and see if we can actually disprove that or find some additional information that might make us reconsider what we believed. And even as scientists, it's very hard. You get caught up in the status quo. You get caught up in confirmation bias. You get caught up in motivated reasoning. All of those factors that go into this. So I think those are really insightful points that you point out.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump on that, I do think there is such a thing as flip-flopping. I mean, and that's not good. It's not that we should constantly change our minds either, right? I mean, it's one thing to double down on a belief and refuse to hear anyone who doesn't think that way or dismiss them as stupid just because they don't think what you think. It's another thing to say, oh, I think the earth is round, but now that I heard this person talk about how it's flat, like I'm going to shift maybe it's flat, right? And then you shift back again. Like that's just crowd pleasing or stupidity, which is, rampant in politics, both of those things, right? And that's not the same as being persuadable.
Well, that's a good point. You make thank you for clarifying on that.
So you've done 10 years now, right? You have a decade of trend analysis. And so where, and by the way, we love, we absolutely love the idea of having the mega trends, like sort of this summary, and I personally really loved how you recap them to kind of say, this is what I thought about and in 2011 and 2012 and, all these different years, it's really cool to look back at those and go, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. But in some ways, I'm kind of curious about what's next. Where do you, are there 500 more of these books ahead?
Well, it was interesting because for people who aren't familiar with like the book series, so I started writing about trends in 2011 and I did it as a digital trend report. And it was essentially, here are the trends that matter. Here was what people in business should be paying attention to. And I did that for 4 years digitally as basically a huge 150-page PowerPoint.
Mm.
And every year it's got more and more audience. It got 100,000, then 200,000, then 400,000 people like downloading this thing. And I realized that there was a bigger idea here. And so in 2015, the 5th year of doing it, I published a full-length book. And the book was not only the trends for that year, because every year I was talking about 15 new trends, but it was also, here's the process behind it. So that's where I first wrote about the haystack method, all the things that you, both of you have been asking about. Like that's the first time that I introduced kind of the behind the scenes of that. And that book hit the Wall Street Journal list. And at that point, it sort of exploded. And for the next 5 years, I did an annual update to that book, which had the year on the cover. And it was like Non-Obvious 2016, Non-Obvious 2017, all the way through to 2019. And then in 2020, January of 2020, 2 months before the pandemic, I published Non-Obvious Megatrends, which I had already announced was going to be the 10th and final edition of this project. And that looked back over every trend that had been predicted. And if you're doing the math, 9 years times 15 trends, like there's well over 100 trends that have been predicted in the past. And so in Megatrends, I had this detailed part of the book where it went through every past trend and graded it based on how it performed over time. And so part of the intention was to add a layer of transparency that's often not there with people who call themselves futurists. They just sort of predict stuff. And the running joke is when someone says, hey, did any of your predictions come true? There's only 2 ways to answer that for a futurist, yes or not yet. And that's basically what they would say, right? And that's such waffling because it doesn't actually take ownership of, hey, I didn't get this quite right. And so I didn't want to do that. And so that detailed appendix led to one part of Megatrends, but the other part, the part that you just alluded to, Tim, is I elevated the thinking. I said, okay, across these 100 plus trends, what were the megatrends that happened over the last 10 years? And could I project forward based on those megatrends? What would matter for the next 10 years? And so the lens of it became different. All of a sudden, I became less of a near futurist and more of an actual futurist. But it was based on this really detailed research. And so the first draft of this book was 500,000 pages. I mean, because
that's big.
It was crazy. I mean, sorry, not pages, 500,000 words.
Oh, okay. Wow. I was going to say, man, that's like 50 big. Bibles.
I mean, that's crazy. That's crazy. Sorry, I misspoke. So 500,000 words. But, for anybody who doesn't understand word counts, like the average business book, and by the way, the length of this book that I wanted was 60,000.
Yeah.
So this had to be cut down dramatically. So like anybody who hasn't seen the book, like don't worry, it's not 500,000 words. It's closer to sort of 65,000 words. It's an average business book length. But you can imagine like boiling all of that research down into these mega ideas and then writing about them. And there were 10 specific mega trends in the book. That was this huge, beautiful exercise that really allowed me to put a capstone on this 10-year of my life, this decade-long project of my life, and allowed me to move on to what I wanted to do next, which was awesome.
So what is that? What are you doing next? What is this?
So there's many things. So number one, we took this Non-Obvious brand and we used the trend research. My team and I at the Non-Obvious company, we used the research to launch this as a much bigger idea than just one book. So now we have the Non-Obvious Guides, which are a series of guidebooks that are like the Dummies Guides, but for smart people. So they actually say on them, not for dummies or idiots. And the back says smart advice for smart people. And the tagline behind the whole thing is like having coffee with an expert. Mm-hmm. So the idea behind that, which was based on one of the trends, was people expect to learn more quickly. And they don't have patience for all of the fluff. And so if you pick up a Dummies Guide, like you'll find a page and a half that describes what a friend on Facebook means. Like the word friend. I mean, who needs that except for a dummy or an idiot, right? Like you don't need that. I don't need that. But like, that's why Dummies Guides are 500 pages long, all of them, because they have that stupidity in them. So we didn't want to do that. We wanted to just cut to the chase, have only the expertise. And that's what we did. So the Non-Obvious Guides was one part. We launched a book awards program, the Non-Obvious Book Awards. I do a weekly show called the Non-Obvious Insight Show. It's all branded to Non-Obvious. Mm-hmm. And we have a podcast, stories-based podcast that's in production right now. So that's going to be coming out. We did a couple virtual summits, including a Non-Obvious Diversity Summit, which was amazing. We had 200 plus speakers, 54 sessions. We just finished that a couple of weeks ago. So this brand is really in my opinion, it's elevated to more than just trends and really more about helping people to see the unusual, be more observant, and be more interesting and open-minded. And so that's what I'm really passionate about. And on the future side, I'm still doing a different book about the future and trends, and that's called The Future Normal, and that'll be coming out in late 2021. And I have a co-author who's an amazing trend researcher himself.
Oh, fantastic.
Henry Coutinho Mason. So that's, coming on the trend and future side, but that's not actually branded non-obvious. That's called The Future Normal.
Moving beyond, but still taking all those key pieces from that. Fantastic.
So what do you do in your spare time?
I sleep, I play soccer, I hang out with my boys. I mean, look, we've all been, it's funny because that you say that, because having been grounded, I didn't realize how much time I was spending in the process of traveling. Ready for traveling, going from one place to another. And now I'm doing these virtual keynotes in my home office. It takes me an hour and I'm still at home. I don't actually have to go anywhere. So all of these things, like, yes, I work hard, but like my wife is my co-founder in 2 of my companies. Like, we work together. Our boys are mostly at home still. So the lifestyle wise, like, we still have a lot of time to like go out, play soccer, work out, like all of those things. Like, those have not fallen off just because we're doing all these other things. Right. And that's important too.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. That hit me just yesterday. I had a workshop that I did with a client in India, and I had to. It started at 5 a.m. for me, but that tiny little inconvenience of having to get up a little early, on Thursday morning was nothing compared to having to otherwise would have had to fly halfway around the world and spend at least a couple days, traveling just to deliver this 2-hour workshop. It is kind of fantastic that the world is getting comfortable with us doing this from our homes.
Yeah, I mean, it's this may be an odd comparison, but I was recalling when I used to play a lot of soccer at a very high level, and I had a knee injury to my right foot, and I'm right-footed, and so I spent the summer basically like working on my left foot, being able to take like corner kicks with my left, having my shooting power improve. And because of that whole thing, I became a much more complete and better player. And I started playing on the left-hand side because my left foot had gotten so good. And now, much later, even though I'm way older and slower and bigger, I still can kick with my left almost as well as I kick with my right because of that one pain moment, right? And I feel like for a lot of people, like, the pandemic has kind of been that knee injury. Like, we forced ourselves to get good at these things that maybe were on the back burner, but like now we've got these newfound skills, and for the rest of our lives, we're going to retain those skills. It's sort of like Tom Cruise way back when he was young, did that bartending movie where he was flipping bottles. And like now 30 years later, he still knows how to flip bottles.
No.
Because he learned it for that bartending movie, right?
Right. And who knew how great a skill that would be?
I mean, I'm sure he flips them every once in a while just for fun. Like,
hey, he has to show off, right? I mean, that's part of this. So
I mean, I would.
Hey, you're at even on video, it's still impressive, right? There you go. So the Non-Obvious Insight Show, which I have started to listen to, you have some great guests, various different pieces on there. And it's like this podcast, you get a lot of great different people that come on. And I'm thinking that, like this podcast, there are certain guests that have just made an impact on you with something that they've said that has kind of go, oh, that is really good. I need to think about that. Are there any 1 or 2 of your guests that come up and what it was that they talked about that you go, this is really good?
Yeah, so many. It's such a great question.
I know, and I hate to do this because it like calls out, and then you're going, "Oh, but I should have said all these others." Yeah.
Look, my memory will tend to go towards the ones that were on most recently, obviously. But I just did the opening session of our diversity summit we did as a live show, and I interviewed a Palestinian American disabled comedian named Maysoon Zaid, who is amazing. She has cerebral palsy, and she is just funny. And one of the things that we talked about was disability and how we treat people with disability. One of the things that she said, which was so impactful. And actually, there's a lot of things that she talked about, which I highly recommend anybody check out, just because she will change your perception of how we talk about people with disabilities. And her sort of running joke is that she has like every strike against her. She's Muslim, she's Palestinian, she's a woman, she has cerebral palsy. I mean, you can, and then her punchline of the joke is, and she lives in New Jersey. So like she's got all of her things stacked up against her, right?
That's great.
And one of the points that she made is that people with disabilities are often portrayed as our inspiration. They're always inspirational. And one of the things she's been very vocal about, and it really made me think, was she does not believe that she would be where she is today as a successful comedian. She's been on General Hospital, the soap opera, as a recurring character. I mean, she's been really, really successful. She does not believe she would be as successful as she is today if social media existed when she was a child. Because when she was a child, she would do all of these things. Like she was in dance recitals because she loved to dance, and her parents put her in the dance recitals, and she couldn't stand up for more than 2 minutes. And doctors said she would never stand. So already she was progressing there. But at 5 years old, she would go to these dance recitals and people would give a standing ovation. And as a 5-year-old, she just thought, well, I must just be a great dancer. And she said, well, now that 5-year-old performance would be posted on Instagram as an inspiration. Like, look at this disabled girl. She's such an inspiration. And there's no way she would think, oh, they're just clapping for me because I'm a great dancer. They would be clapping for her because she's disabled. And she had this opportunity to see herself and build her self-confidence to the point where now she's an adult. Like if somebody says something negative about her, like she can deal with it. But she makes the point that at 5 years old or as a teenager, if she got those negative comments on that video, which of course would happen, right? Because people are mean online, she would give up. She wouldn't keep going. And that really made me think, like, imagine the kids growing up today, especially kids with disabilities, what they have to go through and the cyberbullying and all of those things, and how do they find their self-esteem and their self-confidence?
It's about self-identity, that idea of how our self-identity gets formed, and at what points are you putting yourself out there, and at what points are you just allowing things naturally to occur. And at some point that, putting yourself out there too early or in these ways that is so readily available today, right? My daughter is 11, and I mean, her life is around TikTok and YouTube, and she would love to be a TikToker. And I'm sitting there going, this is not really where you should be putting your focus or effort. But yeah, she doesn't see it that way, and I could see that really making an impact on that. So fantastic.
And one of the things that has been intriguing for me in terms of the behavior of kids around social media, and I have 2 boys. And one of the things that I would just never have done and never would have thought of with social media that they do is they'll post something on Instagram. They'll get like 500 likes within like 2 minutes. I mean, like 2 hours maybe. And then like the next day, they'll just delete it.
Yeah.
Like they don't need it anymore. And when I say to them, like, why would you delete that? They say, well, that's not current anymore. And so they don't look. So like one of the perceptions that has been so hard for me to get my head around, like I look at this stuff as like an archive of my things that I posted. So like that photo I posted back when I was in Moscow, like 10 years ago, like I can go back to that. And it's like, hey, look, I'm in Moscow. And for them, they're like, that was so 3 days ago. I don't need that anymore.
Well, talking about that, you bring up at the very beginning, like it's gathering all this information and then giving yourself this time to think about it and process it. And we're probably of a similar age and different pieces of that. And I'm wondering if, as you said, the younger generation may not have that same piece. If that is a generational thing because of the times that we live in, is it just a point in our lives? Were we the same way when we were in high school and different pieces? Like, that was last week. Why do I care? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting concept to think about.
Yeah, I think that people and teenagers and kids and adults are the same in the sense that like we react to the situation of the world that we're in. And just imagine being a kid, seeing someone post something, and then 6 months later, somebody finds that and they get made fun of for it, or like they get in trouble for it, or their parents see it and they're like, hey, why'd you post that thing 6 months ago? And all it takes is one or two examples, and you can see that the logical thing that any kid would think is, look, I'm just going to post it for now. My friends will enjoy it, and then it's gone. I mean, Snapchat is an entire platform that allows for that, right? It just, you put it for a little bit and then it disappears. And adults and parents have a really hard time understanding that. Like, what if you miss it? What if it's not there? Like, you know what I mean? Like, we don't get that. But that behavior behind that and why that would be popular is logical. Yeah. It's not like you wouldn't understand why that would be appealing.
Yeah. Going back to those human needs, right?
Yeah. My wife has papers she wrote in grad school, like those are in some ways they're dear, but
I got my third grade report on Abraham Lincoln. I mean, come on, like that is, I mean, not that I saved much from there, but I still have that thing.
Was it pretty kick-ass though? Was it a pretty kick-ass report?
The binding was red duct tape, which was pretty ahead of its time. That with yellow construction paper. I mean, that is a serious report.
You put some time, effort, and thought into how it looked for sure.
And I got to say that red duct tape and yellow construction paper 30 years later, man, that has held up. That is impressive stuff.
So I have so that just leads me to yellow, the yellow balloon light bulb, the part of the brand. Where did that come from?
So that was I am a person that has surrounded himself throughout his career either by my intention or by chance with world-class designers. I spent 12 years working in big marketing agencies where the designers were, really best in the world. And when I started my publishing company and when I started doing a lot of this work on book covers, I wanted that same level of design. And so part of it is, and the way that came about is I know how to brief a designer. I'm not a designer, but I know how to give a good brief to a designer. And when you do that properly, you get great results. When you deal with somebody who has talent and you give them the correct guide rails, and people think that creative people in general, not just designers, but creative people in general, love a blank page. That is not actually true.
Yeah.
What they like is knowing what they need to be creative within. Not too many parameters because they're creative people, but enough parameters so that they can create something that they know is going to succeed for whatever it's trying to do, whether it's trying to be intentional or inspirational, or in the case of a book cover, compelling enough that people pick up the book. And so the visual behind that was actually a photograph that we found where it was a light bulb. And for people who aren't looking at it right now, it's a light bulb, but the bulb part of it is a yellow balloon and the bottom of it is actually a light bulb. Mm-hmm. And for us, it was a way of taking this really obvious cliche concept of a light bulb for a book about innovative thinking, which is like, I mean, how could you be more cliche than that? And turning it and twisting it just a little bit so that it added this little layer of non-obviousness. And that was kind of what inspired it.
And why yellow? Why a yellow balloon?
Because yellow pops on a book cover in particular. And on Megatrends, the yellow particularly pops because we use this beautiful silver holographic foil for the printing. So it really pops. But there are colors that pop and are used as contrast. So anybody who studied color design theory or design in general or graphic design knows, like, you use your yellows and your oranges for high contrast and for pops. So part of it was that.
Yeah. It's fantastic. Yeah. And what's interesting, I didn't notice it right away. Right. I mean, when I picked up the book, I got the book, a light bulb on top, and then it wasn't until I think Tim and I were talking about it and I took a second look and I'm going, that's a balloon. That is actually a balloon. And, oh my gosh, that just kind of threw me.
So you'll love this. So we've sold, I think, like 15 different markets for translations of the book.
Okay.
And the Spanish version of the book, when the foreign publisher does it, they typically redo the cover. Sometimes they'll just take the same concept and they'll print it in a different language. Like the Vietnamese version of this is just with the balloon. But the Spanish version, they took that same idea of something that is just a little bit of a twist, but they did it completely differently. So on their cover, they have a lemon tree, like a branch of a lemon tree, but instead of a hanging lemon, the lemon is a tennis ball.
Ooh.
And that's the concept for the Spanish version of the book. So, similar idea, and it's yellow, right?
Yeah.
but like similar concept, but not the balloon. It's something totally different. So like, it's really interesting to see how these things get reimagined when they go to different cultures.
Wow.
All right, so
I love that.
So I know Tim is jonesing to talk about music, but I have one question before we do that. So I love as part of these trend pieces, you come up with these fantastic names, right? You name your trends, and they are these both descriptive, intriguing yet informative names like virtual empathy, retro trust. Is there one or two of those that just stand out in your mind as kind of like, hey, this is a cool name that really captures what this trend was and is one of the key things for you as you're moving forward? Putting you on the spot again, with your favorite guests and other things.
No, there definitely are. So there's so many. I mean, there's an entire section in the book about naming.
I know, it's fantastic.
And there's so many ways I think about that, because you could do names that rhyme with one another. You could do a made up name. I mean, my second book was called Likeonomics. It was about why we do business with people that we like, but that's a made up word, right? So like that would be one. My first book was called Personality Not Included, and it was a play off of Batteries Not Included. As in, you need the batteries, but no one gives them to you. You have to get them. And so personality is kind of the same thing when it comes to branding. Like you need a personality, but like nobody tells you need one. Like you need to get it. So that's another way that I think about it. In terms of the names of trends, I like the idea of like a double letter. So like one of the trends that was really popular, and I'm going to go with ones that were popular as opposed to what I, like, because a lot of times they're the same, but like there was a trend I wrote about that I called fierce femininity.
Okay.
And it was sort of spotlighting this idea that the old school way of portraying women, if you think about media or TV, is the princess in the tower who needs to be saved. The new version is Hunger Games, where it's like she's not waiting to be saved. She's kicking ass, and sometimes she's saving the dude, and sometimes she lets him die. That was this level of fierceness. And so you pair the word fierce with the word femininity, which is often not portrayed as anything close to fierce.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. Like that duality is interesting. Like we had another one that I called Small Data, and it was about paying attention to these little nuances in a world where at that time when I wrote that, everyone was talking about big data. So it was sort of a counterpoint to like, hey, it's all about big data, but actually what about small data? So sometimes it's sort of a counterpoint to that. Sometimes it's sort of this made up word. Retro trust was about how in a world where everything's fake, we don't know what to believe. So we actually turn the clock backward and we start to trust in those retro things that we used to do, like the Nintendo that I used to play when I was younger, or listening to vinyl music, or making puzzles again, or bringing He-Man back, which is a bad idea on many levels. So like that is all examples of retro.
Oh, Solitaire, come on! How could you deny that?
I mean, that was just an odd show. Like he lifts a sword and he changes himself to be a superhero that looks exactly like he looked before, just with no shirt on. I mean, come on, how does that make any sense?
Well, Superman puts on a disguise of glasses. Come, if you're going to talk, superheroes here,
he
come
didn't
on.
even have glasses. Like at least Clark Kent had the glasses, which totally changed his look, right? And plus he had that little like curl in his hair, which he didn't have. Like, so nobody would recognize Clark Kent, but like, He-Man and Adam, like, come on, that wasn't believable.
Okay, quickly, what's on your playlist right now?
I am a big listener to Latin music. I love Latin music. There's nothing that makes you move like that. So Fannie Lou, I love this. All the music she has is just phenomenal. But like, there's so many others. Like Maná from Mexico is a great band, and they've been making amazing music for a long, long time. So like, that is the music I like. I mean, I like a lot of different types of music.
Contemporary. You're not like into this. You're not listening to traditional stuff. This isn't like bossa nova or things like that.
No, I mean, there is some old, like Carlos Vives has been around forever, and so like he's been making music. But then he had like this new remake of I think it was a remake of a song, or maybe a new song with Shakira. So like they did that like together, but it was like, but he's been around like for 20, 30 years and like singing all this songs. So like him or Juanes, who I actually met one time, which was like an awesome story. Like that was just like off the charts because I was doing a talk for I think it was like Telemundo or somebody, and they were like, yeah, we have all this executives, and it was in like this room with couches and stuff. It was like this total lounge thing, and I was the business speaker. But they're like, yeah, we have a special entertainer, and then they brought out Juanes, who's like a really famous Latin musician, and I was like the first fanboy in line, like, oh my god, it's Juanes, and all these like Latin executives are like, what does this Indian dude know about Latin music? Like, how does he even know who Juanes is? And I was like, oh man, like he's just he was great. Yeah.
Oh, that's terrific. Okay, and do you like to listen to music while you work?
Sometimes. I do find it to be distracting. What I listen to most when I'm listening to music when I work is not really music. It's actually background noise. And one of my favorite websites is called Coffeetivity. And it basically is a site that simulates the sound of a coffee shop in the background.
Oh, yeah.
And I've written 3 books to Coffeetivity playing in the background.
Fantastic.
We've heard that. We've heard people talk about this idea that, hey, if I'm working, I can't have music, particularly with lyrics, but I like having something, that white noise, different pieces. And I know that we've talked with people who've talked about apps. I haven't heard of Coffeetivity. That sounds cool, though. So
yeah, it's Coffeetivity.
Coffee.
Yeah, so coffee. It's like coffee and productivity together in one word.
It's retro. It's the made up words, right?
The same thing. It's like it's a good brand name. And it's what's funny is you can choose like a Parisian cafe or like a Brazilian bistro, and like you hear little remnants of like the Brazilian bistro. You hear like a little bit of Portuguese in the background there, and like French is a distinctive language, so like you hear a little bit of the French back. So you can choose your vibe of coffee shop.
All right,
I love it. Rohit, thank you so much for being our guest on Behavior Grooves today.
You are totally welcome. I had such a great time.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our conversation with Rohit, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our speed understanding minds.
Oh, yeah. Isaac Asimov. Get down with that.
Yeah. We're not speed readers, that's for damn sure. But man, maybe we are speed understanders. Do you think we are?
I'm not. I'm damn sure I'm not. I am a reflective thinker. It takes me time to figure shit out, and I like having time to come. It's if I'm really well prepared for a specific conversation, and
so not like any of the podcasts that we do. Those other areas of your life where you're really well prepared.
Right. Because basically all those conversations that we have with guests, just making shit up. but and I do, I even come away from conversations that we've had, even with Rohit, where I think, oh man, I should have asked this question, or wouldn't it have been great to talk about this? I always have that after the fact kind of thinking. So learning to be a speed understander, if there's a skill that I would like to develop, this is it.
Well, and I think that the actual concept about speed understanding isn't that you fully get the concepts right away.
Instantly,
it's this idea that instead of just trying to read through things quickly, it's read through them with intent and to reflect, as you mentioned, and to take the time and actually to understand them, as opposed to, I've read 15 books this month and I can't remember anything from them, versus I've read 1 book this month and I can tell you all about the implications of what that 1 book means. I think that's the piece that I took out of it. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I understand it. And I was very quick on understanding that.
You're a speed understander. You get a badge this week for being a speed understander. We should have a badge. Yeah.
Oh, that would be fun.
all part of the Behavioral Grooves organization.
You know what? We can make that. We'll put that out on our store whenever we get a store out there. It'll be the speed understander badge.
And we could give our new employee, Mary, a speed understander badge when she earns it, of course.
Of course. She has to understand us, which she'd never get it then.
I had something to say about infobesity and you were talking about reading books, and you and I read a lot of books because we have a lot of guests that write books, and so we actually do read the books before we talk to them, and so that causes us to read a lot of books.
Yes, we always read the books, every word.
What I find is that I get so much more out of the books when I'm making notes, as I'm going through, I'm processing the content of the author and asking questions or making comments. So those notes aren't always they aren't always like, oh, make sure you do this. But sometimes it's like, why does this work? Or what about this other thing?
There is actually something about reading a book, knowing that you're going to be interviewing that author about that book.
Yeah.
That for me does exactly what you're just saying. It makes me think about the concepts that are going on in that book in a different manner, which again is part of what Rowett talks about later in kind of paying attention in various different pieces. But it really is this different focus for how you approach understanding that book. It's not, I got to get through this, because if I get through it, but I don't remember any of it, it's not going to do us any good in the conversation. You need to be able to understand the concepts and then formulate decent questions out of that actually are not just, hey, tell me about your book kind of questions.
I've been doing this since high school. When I read the Odyssey, I'm remember getting to the point where Odysseus and his son, was it Telemachus, are coming back into the chamber, and they're plotting to figure out how they're going to kill everybody so that he can get back with Penelope, his wife. And I'm like, why do just like steal her, just like, rescue her in the dark of night and just go and leave. And why fuss with all the battles? But, and so I made those notes in the margin, I just, and so,
to this day,
I remember that.
You can remember that. So think about that, which is a fantastic element that just highlights this very fact that you did not speed read the Odyssey. Right.
And I didn't speed understand it either.
but you took the time to reflect. You took the time to take notes. You took the time to think about this in a way that then cemented that into your brain. And now, 40 some years later,
no, it's like 10 years. 10 years.
Oh, 10 years. From high school. From high school. And note, Tim is delusional. Okay.
How about if we talk about the haystack method?
The haystack method. Gathering, aggregating, elevating, naming, and proving, the 5 steps to this. And I love this idea, right? This idea that we can all start to predict things if we look at the world and have a process of gathering information, aggregating that information, finding those common themes. I love the naming part, giving it some provocative, really descriptive name, and then going back and proving that, checking it, being a scientist about it and just going, oh, here we go. I love that concept.
One of the most valuable things I did in my last job in the corporate world was that I had a monthly business update with the president of the company. And so he and I would sit down and review really all aspects of everything within my scope of responsibility. And it was a really great thing for me to have to go back every month and look at the breadth of stuff that me and my teams were involved in. And that was a really great way of going, okay, are we making progress? When I think about, progress principle, was there a sense of, forward movement? Because it's too easy to get trapped in the day to day. So having some kind of something that you lock into on a regular basis and say, how's this looking? What are we seeing? Let's actually process this a little bit. Let's be intentional.
I think that gets to the gathering part, right? But then it's also the aggregating that and elevating it, kind of saying, all right, we've done gathering all these stories about what we've done. We've done this story, this story, this story, this story, and then looking and saying, all right, let's pull these together. These 3 stories fit together. These 2 stories fit together. And then what are the themes? There's an underlying theme underneath all of these things. But this concept, I love the idea of putting that into your work. I think we can put it into our lives. We can put it into the larger society piece too, of saying, if you are at all interested in trying to look forward as to what's going on, and I think a lot of this could be industry specific. It could be your field of research area, but looking out and saying, to do this method could be very valuable just to get an understanding of what are the trends that are happening. Where do we, if you plot out 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, where do you think it's going? Not just from a gut feel, but hey, we've gathered stuff for the past year, these different articles about X and the stories that people have told about Y. And wow, look at Y and X actually have some commonalities. There's this element of we can pull some pieces from them and put them together, and there's an underlying cause behind it, but nobody's really looking at that. That could be really powerful for both researchers, but as well for business. And I think it's fascinating.
It's also good to be looking outside of your area of expertise. That's really critical. And I think about times when my old boss and I would leave the office on various occasions to go to hear talks at local universities from experts in fields that had nothing to do with what we were doing. One time we listened to Maeve Leakey, the paleoanthropologist, who is a foremost expert in the world of what happened to our ancestors millions of years ago. What were they like, and what was the population and the development of encephalization and bipedalization and then manual dexterity, and how did those things happen? And to be able to just hear someone speak with such expertise just gave us a perspective, gave me a perspective coming away from it that I could bring back to my work. I thought it was a really good thing. So I want to encourage people to do that.
Which goes to the next piece that I want to talk about. That Rohit was talking about, the power of observation, and the idea that it's not a talent, that he doesn't have some innate born talent to decipher the tea leaves and he can predict, right? It's this skill, it's a mindset, it's this idea of being intentional, and it's something that you can train yourself to do and to do this. So using the haystack method, but even just more generally, being observant not just within your area of expertise, as you just said. I love the concept of going out and seeing presentations by experts in other areas that have very little practical application to what you're doing. But those are where you get those creative sparks, that idea that, wow, this is similar in one way to what we're doing over here. And now I have a different view, a different lens to view that thing over here through, which is the power. And I bet we could talk to, all the people that we know that do brainstorming and creative work, and the Adam Hansons of the world and different pieces, and they would agree that there's value in taking a whole different subset of knowledge and applying some of the insights of that into this area that you're looking at. And so that was cool.
Actually, as I'm reflecting on it, one of those sessions where my old boss and I were like, let's get out of the office, let's do something different. That's how I met Dan Ariely.
Oh.
It was actually one of those things. I wasn't all that interested in psychology per se in 2005 or 2006 or whenever it was that I went to a presentation and Dan spoke and totally caught my attention, and we became friends and did some work together and all that kind of stuff. So you never know what could happen. Get out, do something different.
Go out there and do something. And one of the pieces, so coming back to some of the stuff that we talked about in the episode, this is this idea that, hey, I love the concept when he was talking about looking at a picture. And we tend to look at pictures and we all kind of stare at the same thing. And actually, Dan Hill, who we've talked with before, has done those eye tracking things on actual art pieces and notices that, hey, 80% of the people look at the face and we don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to the other things. And what Rowan is saying, look in the corners, look in the bottom of the picture, look at different pieces and really pay attention to what's going on there. Looking at the margins and saying, why is this here? And trying to think through, again, taking that reflective view from being a speed understander and helping that point of view to these non-obvious things. Again, he talked about watching an NFL game, and we tend to all watch the quarterback and, where the ball is, but pay attention to the refs. Where are the refs? Look at where, what's going on the sideline. And some of those observations, I think, could be really powerful in just putting a different perspective on the world, which again gives us that different frame with which we can look at different things.
It's kind of a journalist mindset, because journalists are not just looking for what's the main story, but what are the sub stories, what's going on in the margins, and they have to pay attention to those kinds of things.
So again, going back to what Rowan was saying, he reads Teen Vogue. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not targeted for him. It's not any of this stuff for him. He's reading Teen Vogue. I mean, oh my gosh.
I know.
I was thinking, like, and this is a question for you and me, is what are the areas that we should be looking into? I mean, Teen Vogue probably isn't it, but are there other areas, other publications, other ways of looking at the world that may be tangential to behavioral science that isn't behavioral science, that we should just start subscribing to X magazine or getting whatever newsletter it is?
Well, are you doing that now, or do you don't only read psychological and behavioral science?
No, I don't.
Stuff?
But I kind of stay within a circle. So, like, one of my favorites is New Scientist, which is a general science, and they talk physics to some behavioral science stuff to chemistry to all sorts of different kind of science things. It's a British journal, comes out weekly, so it's cool.
Yeah.
And then obviously there's the news feeds that I get that are just general news.
Yeah.
But I'm not looking at anthropology stuff. I'm not looking at musical theory. I don't know. You might be. I'm not looking at other potential areas that could shed some different perspectives on the world that we live in. And I think we probably should. We should probably be doing that.
Get your hedge fox on, man. Get that, because Katie and I subscribe to Smithsonian and National Geographic, in addition to New Yorker, Atlantic, New York Times, stuff like that. But sort of basic news type stuff. And music. I have a regular feed of music as well. But that's just kind of part and parcel to who I am. So it's not a big deal necessarily. But the Teen Vogue thing, right? You brought up the Teen Vogue discussion where he was talking about the outrage, right? This was so cool about how he sees this list of things that you should be outraged about, and it does not connect to a 40-something-year-old dad. Just right? Zero connection.
The things that a 13-year-old girl should be outraged about are not the same. But it brings this idea of change, and this idea, because we were talking about change and how change is hard, and this idea of confirmation bias that we have, and our pre-held beliefs are really hard to get over, status quo bias, all of those factors. But I love this concept that there's this checklist that Teen Vogue is putting out, that these are the things you should be outraged about. And if I was a 13-year-old girl and I not outraged by that, what does that... The social norms around that. Do you feel outcast? And then do you feel part of the tribe? And all of those in-group, out-group pieces. And change really can be about not just our self-identity, but it's our social identity. And the ability to change something. Do you just do things to fit in? And again, that's where change is hard. If the social norm is X and you like Y, it's hard to go against the social norm. And so we often get pulled back into the fold and say, well, all right, I guess X is all right.
I guess I should be outraged because Teen Vogue says that these are the things that I should be outraged about, right? Okay, but staying on Teen Vogue, I think that this is really cool because this gets into something that we talked about about deleting online archives, like getting rid of the old stuff, right?
Yes,
and there's a perfect Teen Vogue story here.
This idea that we should, is what did he call it? Is not a purge, but he said we need to deleting those online archives, and the idea that kids doing this and people are doing this, and we wonder why would you ever do that? And then talking about, well, those archives can be held against us. We're not thinking, we're having fun. We're in a different stage. And this is a big piece about context that you've always talked about. And, going back, are we the same person that we are today? And have we grown different things? But the Teen Vogue piece, right? So Alexi McCammon, who recently was, got promoted to be an editor of Teen Vogue. And then
big damn job. Yeah.
Then there were these tweets, these old tweets of hers that surfaced that she was kind of disrespectful, she was disrespectful to Chinese and other nationalities. And she had to quit because these came back to haunt her. And it gets into a bit about cancel culture and other kind of pieces of going on today. But there's also this aspect that this context, like what was the context of when the tweet was made? What was the prevailing norms at the time? And I'm not trying to justify anything that Alexi said or any of these, people who have said very hurtful and harmful things in the past. But there is this concept where you're telling a joke and the joke falls flat, and then 3, 5, 10 years later, that gets brought back up. And now there's a different cultural norm around the type of joke that you were telling. And it becomes this fodder for a whole hate-filled, you are an evil person. And A, you got to understand the context that it happens. And B, maybe you've grown within those 5, 10 years. And, do we hold that person, that 18-year-old, accountable for all the stupid? Because I know if we had social media when I was 18, oh my God, I'd have to delete an entire archive of work.
Well, we don't hold the 5-year-old accountable for hitting their brother or sister when they're 5, as adults. We don't go back to them and say, remember when you hit your sister when she was just 5 and you were 5.5 and 6?
Well, she remembers that and she holds it against him. That's for damn sure.
Well, so here's the question that I have is, to what degree is it appropriate for us to use a current lens? We're recording this in March of 2021. To what degree is it appropriate for us to hold a lens that we've developed today to view historical events?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have a good answer for that, but that's the question that I have, is to what degree should we or shouldn't we hold people accountable for things that they did in the past? It reminds me of Bill Clinton being asked if he smoked pot in college. It reminds me of political figures who have been, it's been revealed that in college they wore blackface. Again, I'm not saying that it's a good thing or a bad thing, but there was a context, both their age and their social environment, for better or for worse, that contributed to that, just as the social context in our age and our wisdom contributes to where we're at right now, where we might be in 10 years or 20 years.
Exactly. And I think there is an aspect of this that goes back to something we talked with John Levy about, is this idea of benevolence. What was the intent behind this? Going to the blackface. And again, I'm not saying that was a good thing to do, but there's a difference of wearing blackface to mock a culture in a situation, or to even with this understanding of what that blackface might imply to certain people, people of color, that this is just degrading and wrong. And then there's another aspect of just ignorance is probably not the right word, but the intent is not that. The intent is, hey, I'm dressing up as a one of my favorite people, the sports figure who happens to be a person of color. I think there's two very different elements of that. And that is, I think that gets lost. And again, I'm not saying that we can just forgive and that all of a sudden, just because you didn't had a benevolent aspect of it, that it's not wrong thing to do. But it is something that needs to be taken into consideration, in my opinion, when we are looking at how much do we hold these people accountable, and what is the retribution that they then get.
Well, intention certainly does make a difference in our laws. Someone dies at my hand. If I had premeditated it, that's first degree murder. Then there's second degree murder and third degree murder. Then there's a couple degrees of manslaughter. Mm-hmm. So there's multiple ways of looking at the relationship between someone who acts as, for lack of a better word, a killer, and the victim. Mm-hmm. And intention is a critical part of that. So I think that would be interesting to talk about on some other occasion.
we got deep, man. What the hell? All right.
Deep.
All right. With that, everybody, please hang on, because Tim is going to give us a fantastic bonus track.
This is Tim with our bonus track and groove idea for the week. Our discussion with Rowett had both Kurt and me wondering how good we are at paying attention. The idea that we can peer into the future, or at least get a better glimpse at what is going to happen around the corner, is really appealing. We started by talking with Rowett about the difference of speed reading and speed understanding. With the amount of information that is thrown at us every day, we have infobesity. We don't need to read faster, we need to read smarter and be a speed understander. We talked a lot about paying attention, and paying attention to a world around us is in a more purposeful way and intentional way, particularly looking at the wide scope of ideas and taking note of those ideas. He noted that paying attention is a learnable skill, one that you can hone if you practice it daily. Rowett's haystack method for identifying trends starts with gathering, saving interesting ideas that you come across. It then moves on to aggregating that information, putting things into clusters that have some connection, paying attention to how disparate items may be connected. Then it's about elevating. Elevate these clusters to look for a broader theme. Is there something deeper at work here? Then it gets into the fun part of naming that theme, like using language as a description, and to move maybe to something that's a bit more provocative. Finally, it's the proving stage. Is this trend actually true? Is this looking at the evidence and ensuring that we are not just confirming our pre-held biases? We also discussed why change is so hard, how sometimes in some situations we should delete our old archives. And of course, we discussed some wonderful music with Rowett. On to our groove idea for the week. We're going to ask you to play a game. Immediately after hearing this podcast, try to notice something in your environment that you think nobody else is noticing. If that is a cobweb in the corner of the room, or the way people are responding to an underlying stressor in your community, pay attention and notice the subtle things around you. Write it down and send us what you find in a tweet. Tag @BehavioralGroove and let us know that what you are observing. We want to hear about it. With that, we want to thank you for listening. We do appreciate the time you spend with us, and we hope that it's valuable. If it is, please leave us a review or share this episode with a friend. And with that, we encourage you this week to go out and find your groove.